The key idea, if anybody comes away from our conversations here, is we've spent a century trying to react to fire really, really potently and to try to put it in a box. And the fact of the matter is that's a failed proposition. It doesn't mean we stop doing fire suppression. We still have a highly motivated and effective suppression workforce. It means we start living proactively with wildfire and learn how to more and more literally live with wildfire, because it's not going away. There is no low smoke, low fire scenario on the table for us, and we got to embrace that. And I think we can, actually. I think it's a hopeful message. We have tools, we have building blocks. What we need to do is get people to work together to go in that direction. We know that there was a lot of fire on the Western North American landscape. It's a landscape of fire. It's born of fire. It develops a life history with fire. Species are adapted. Plants and animals are adapted to fire. They know how to make a living around fire. But what we didn't understand until we started developing pretty substantial landscape reconstructions was that the amount of fire was in sync with the climate. And the climate would reduce or allow forest area to accrue in sync with the temp, precip, and solar radiation that was coming into the system. During very mild climate periods, the area of forest would increase. During more severe or drier, hotter periods, forest area would decrease, and that would create early cereal conditions, burned bare ground, grasses, shrub fields, really sparsely wooded savannas, things like that, all driven by a grass or a shrub fuel model, flashy fuels. And that was the vehicle for essentially reducing the amount of connectivity of forest that would burn severely over space and time. So over years of fires burning on the landscape, a severe drought year would reduce forest area, and that would flip the landscape towards a dynamic where more benign fire was going to work on that landscape for a while because the primary fuels were flashy. If the climate got less severe and more productive, more forest area would occur, and as soon as the climate would switch, the amount of early cereal condition on that landscape would adjust with the climate forcing that was going on. So what we've learned is early cereal forest conditions are a critical context for how the patchwork of forest will burn. There's a coarse life form patchwork that is influential on the patchwork of forest cereal stages. So we found out that there are levels of landscapes and they crosstalk with each other, they're connected. And what we do at small, medium, and large scales has consequences, and it produces linked interactions. The way we think about it in landscape ecology is that there are levels of structural and compositional organization, and they talk to each other. There are linked connections, there's crosstalk between them, and that's actually really cool stuff because it actually gives you a visual for where the solutions live. If I work on the patchiness of trees at a patch level, there's crosstalk between that and the next higher level, and it influences fire behavior at the next level of organization. If I don't do that, then I have consequences driven by the lack of that patchiness, that lack of those gaps. Restoring the crosstalk between those levels gives us a hopeful way of basically producing the kinds of connections we want on a more functional landscape. So it's like the language of the landscape. The Native Americans and the First Nations here in the Canadas had this 10,000-year relationship with the landscape where they lived in it, and if they didn't connect well with fire, they died. And so they became cultures of burners who figured out how to live with fire, how to literally coexist with fire, and then use it as a management tool to get the stuff that they needed from that landscape, to grow this oak but not that one, to get it to sprout at this time and produce this caliber of stems so they could weave baskets from it. Incredibly sophisticated uses of fire. Sometimes when I think about the uses of fire that they had, I think they've probably forgotten more than we know about how to use fire. They knew so much. It's every time I go to a new geography and I work with tribes, I'm blown away by the cultural knowledge that's embedded in their traditions. And it's different from the last place I was. There's so much knowledge to be captured, and we're losing it right now. Daughters and sons will say, my grandmother was a burner, and I remember some of her stories, but my mother wasn't a burner, and I've not been a burner. And so there's that loss of the deep connection. And so we're literally trying to glean so much from asking questions and taking us out to the woods. Show us where you did it. Does this look like that, you know? We have to really buy into the notion that the wildfire regime is inextricably linked to the climatic regime. And when the climate goes through its mood swings, it has impacts on the fire regime. And it becomes critically important that if we don't embed in our management a high-functioning fire regime, it's going to cause failure in many of the things that we try to accomplish with our fire. It's a trump card. Like I said in my presentation, wildfire and forest succession are the engine that drive the system, and climate is the fuel for that engine. The thought experiment that I used in my talk was, if I gave you magically the landscapes of 300 years ago when Aboriginals were burning them, and then I superimposed this climate and the changes that are coming, you'd see a gradual morphing of the landscape under the influence of that. It's because the landscape was prepared for fire, and the fires that were coming were typical of the variability of fires for those forest types. Roll the film. We have the landscapes of today. They're not adjusted to the fire regime, so those same climate influences are producing much more severe adjustments of the landscape because there's so much fuel, the forest, there's so much forest area, and there's so much density. So the way to adapt them is to literally redevelop the fuel patterns and the forest successional patterns that support the fire regime that you're interested in. When you do that, climate change will more gently nudge those patterns on the landscape than wholesale change them abruptly. And we're seeing the abrupt wholesale changes at a very large scale now. Mountain pine beetle outbreaks that cause mortality on tens of millions of hectares in 15 years, literally obliterating a major forest type in the province. Hundreds of thousands of hectares of spruce beetle outbreaks suddenly happening. Douglas fir beetle is blowing up on massive acreages right now, literally telling you there are so many trees, you're beyond your carrying capacity for this climate. And what it's doing is thinning those forests down to a carrying capacity and it's doing it not benignly, but somewhat more indiscriminately than we would choose to do it. So literally developing those supportive successional patterns and fuel patterns that create the variability of that fire regime we want, and then allow climate change as it goes through its mood swings to morph that, but more gently, more predictably, with less uncertainty. Reburns are important, we're learning. Our whole notion of how the landscape burned historically is kind of turned on its ear. We know that fire sizes had different frequencies, lots of small fires, fewer medium-sized fires, very infrequent large fires, but those large fires burned most of the landscape. What we learned is the small and medium-sized fires pockmark those large burned areas and they recomplexify the forest. But the reburning does an amazing thing that we didn't see coming, and that is it consumes the dead wood so that you don't have massive fuel beds driving the wildfire scenario. So it's reburning that creates the fuel limitation that allows the benign fire delivery system on the landscape. Rather than fire happening here and hither and yon over time, it's reburn after reburning, adding the complexity of that landscape. And the reburning is consuming fuel. So there's a lot of burning going on in that historical landscape compared to the current one. Now when you think about the landscape in that way, you see, my God, there's so much fuel by contrast with that formula 100 years ago. Just sort of stepping back in time a little bit, what you see is we're the first generations in North America to not live well with fire. For 10,000 years, people learned how to live with fire, and we didn't. And we've only been around a pretty short period of time. That's a little bit crazy when you think about it, right? There's a lot to learn. If you're in a fire-prone landscape, how do I live with it? How do I be clever with fire? How do I use it to my fullest advantage? That's the question we need to start asking, not how do we make it go away? There's no making it go away. There's a lot of skill in North America among fire scientists and fire managers to be able to identify those burn windows when we can take natural ignitions on the landscape and do work with them. We know what sorts of meteorology support fuel availability to burn and the kind of energy release that's going to come out of those fuel beds. And so literally in as many burn days as we can, taking those ignitions and letting them do work. In order to do that, we need to give fire managers a landscape that's set up to do that. So we need to do fire use planning. And what that really means is developing a clear understanding of what our surface and canopy fuels are on that landscape, modeling fire behavior under different fire weather scenarios, and then creating anchor points and control points on the landscape that give wildfire overhead teams, incident command teams, the ability to say, today I'm going to hook the fire right here and I'm going to hold it in a container for 3 days because we've got a storm coming through, and I'm going to hook this fire and hold it right here, and then on day 4 of the burn period I'm going to let it go and I'm going to let it do some work. So literally using the burn periods that you have available to you to let the wildfire do more prescribed burning work on the landscape. We have relatively unregulated freedom to be able to use wildfires. Prescribed burning, there isn't the social license right now to burn with a really big footprint. We really need to do that, but until that happens, we have to make wildfires work for us more potently.